The next ecosystem we're covering is wetlands, and they're the most productive ecosystems on Earth. They're as productive as the most productive croplands because there's plenty of water, and at least they are in warmer areas. Obviously, not necessarily, and some of them are fairly nutrient poor. Those are fed by rainwater, but those that are fed by rivers and such are extraordinarily productive. Herbivory is not extraordinarily important in most systems. There is some, but there's a lot of dominance by macrophytes, and the plants just sort of rule. And as we talked about in the section on wetlands, is hydrology is just super important, and depending on how we define wetlands, how much flow through there is and nutrient sources. So if it's this perched wetland that just gets rain, it's going to have very low productivity and be very oligotrophic. And remember, we have adaptations to that, like the carnivorous plants that get their nitrogen by eating insects. And we can do the same kind of thing. This is just a carbon budget for a wetland. And we see, whereas in a lake, we wouldn't have the production by trees and shrubs and such, it really it dominates the carbon influx there. So it's a toxinous above the water, at least, and a lot of that litter, almost half of that, falls in and turns into detritus and logs and sediment. But algae are there, that they're just not quite as important. And then we can see that there's terrestrial respiration is the highest in this particular case. Most of the biomass is up above, but there's a substantial amount of aerobic aquatic respiration. And this is an early study done by an ex-colleague of mine who passed away from Lou Gehrig's disease a few years back, Pat Mulholland, one of my science heroes. And I just wanted to give this example of the Pantanal. It's one of the world's largest wetland ecosystem complexes. It's in Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay. And it is a seasonal wetland. There's certain parts that are always wet along the Paraguay River, but other parts that dry up. And the pools isolate, and they concentrate fish and their predators. And it seems that the caimans are somewhat ecosystem engineers, and that they actually scoop out the pools, but then as the fish concentrate in them, the caiman can, the crocodilians can eat those fishes. And it's home to a lot of endangered species, including jaguars and other things. As with many places in the world, there's plans to channelize the river. There is under threat from human activities. So in this case, they want to channelize the river so they can move stuff up and down, and also it would dry out a lot of areas, which would make for better cattle grazing, but it would not, and they wouldn't flood anymore. But it would decrease the upper part of the area of the wetland by half. So it's controversial. I think it's going forward. The current president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, is anti-environmentalist, and he's doing a lot of things as far as deforestation in the Amazon and this kind of thing that are not necessarily in the best interest of everyone, and certainly not the organisms that are there. So here's a picture of the area, this blue area here. Just, you know, sort of, you can get an idea. I mean, that's almost as big as the whole country of Ecuador. Brazil's a large country. It's almost the size of the United States. And so you can imagine what the size. It's just quite remote, that, you know, there's not really the huge cities there. And what happens is during the wet season, the water, the rain falls, more rain falls in the north than the south. This is tropical rainforest in this region here. This is the Cerrado, which is a grassland, so it's going to be a little bit drier, a savanna. And this part over here is actually sort of deserty. And then there's one of the driest places in the world is right here. So you get this rain shadow over here, and then you get this increase in precipitation that's seasonal. And these images are a little bit difficult to see, but you can get an idea of it. The green is the flooded forest, and then the flooded grasslands and pasture are in the red. And we see that in January, and so this would be the middle of summer, right? Because we're in the southern hemisphere. The northern part is flooded, but as we move through February and May, the flooding is moving down through the system. So the rain that falls more up here, it takes months to move its way through, and it floods and fills up the different habitats. Here's a montage of, again, another picture of the area of these wetlands. And the top one's a satellite image, so you can just get an idea of all the pools and rivulets and things that go through it. The next one's an aerial image, and this is during the time of flooding, so all of these wetlands are flooded out of the mainstream channel, river channel. And then we talked about the pools concentrating the caiman and the fishes, and here's a bunch of caiman on the bank of a pool during the dry season. My colleague Steve Hamilton took these photos down here, and he was researching there. And this is a giant otter, one of the endangered species there. It's 2 meters long, 6 feet long, and he was in his waders up to his chest, and one of them came right up to him and sort of looked at him in the face. He said it was pretty scary. They have big teeth, but it didn't do anything to them. They subsist on fishes mostly. And then these capybaras off on the right, a picture from Wiki Commons, and they also are ecosystem engineers. They go out into the fields and the dry areas during nighttime and graze, and then during the day they go back in the water where they can stay away from predation by jaguars and things, and pumas and things like that. Okay, so now we've gone through the major ecosystem characteristic, and I want to talk a little bit about how we classify wetlands and lakes and streams, and really there's these gradients that everything's occurring on, and this image tries to put together these ideas of ways to think about these habitats in a more general sense. So you can think of a stream, but if it slows way, way down, it might be closer to a lake than a stream. And we talked about, like in the river continuum concept, how if you get down to the bottom of a big swell river, it's got phytoplankton and zooplankton in it. So it's almost more like a lake than it is like a high mountain stream or something like that. And so we can think about these gradients and what happens to these. And the first gradient would be light from none to full sun, and the net primary production. So allochthonous versus autochthonous, right? Self-feeding versus other feeding, carbon coming in from outside, allochthonous versus autochthonous. And groundwaters are completely dark, right? So that they have to have external carbon almost certainly from the outside, unless they're a system that's driven by chemoautotrophy. But most of them basically rely on organic carbon from outside. Then you can move into something like a shaded stream or a very small pond, and then open streams that get more productive as we move downstream in the river continuum concept. And then wetlands and lakes, which are in the full sun, and they can be quite highly productive. We can also think about hydrologic turnover time. So we thought about the largest lakes. Lake Tahoe, hundreds of years of turnover. Lake Baikal, thousands of years for the average water molecule to move in and out of that gigantic lake. And contrast that to a portion of a stream where water might be there for minutes if you have a small enough area. We were on Kings Creek in Kanza. The water flows completely out of that whole watershed. It takes about half a day for it to get out. And we talked about some of those aquifers that were thousands of years old. The High Plains aquifer, the Ogallala, right? Took thousands and thousands of years to fill up, and now we're depleting it at a much faster rate. But the water turnover is very slow in that system, so it's basically mining. It's not a renewable resource per se. And the very large lakes over here, and then some groundwater moves pretty quick. So we talk about karst moving, things moving through karst aquifers quickly. Small lakes turn over more quickly, water turns over more quickly than large ones. So these have impacts on how much nutrient stays in and the budgets and what can live in them. Phytoplankton can't live in streams, right? Because they are washed away so quicker than they can divide. And then we can talk about depth and productivity, where we have it's sort of linked to light, right? So wetlands are highly productive because they're quite shallow and the plants can grow up out of the wetland. Streams can be quite productive. And then as we get deeper, macrophytes maybe can drop out, and phytoplankton in the center parts of the lakes open up. And the next gradient we can talk about is variance. So we talked about the natural flow regime in rivers and streams, right? And they have quite a high hydrologic variance, unless they happen to be fed by groundwater. Groundwater streams, such as the rivers and the sand hills of Nebraska, can be a much less variable, and we talked about that in the stream section, and the extreme version of the river, the Slaty River in New Zealand, where the storms came in every week and caused it to flood. And then as we get into deep groundwaters, things are very constant. The turnover takes a long time, and the average rainstorm isn't going to do much, and same with large lakes. We can think of seasonal variance. So assuming that there is seasonal variance, again, the deep groundwater is relatively isolated from seasonal variance. And if you go to springs and groundwater, the temperature of the water is generally the average temperature throughout the year, because it's cold on the surface and warm on the surface, but as that works its way and equilibrates down in, then those temperatures just reflect the average annual temperature. As opposed to something that's exposed to a lot of sunlight, you can have a lot and maybe variable precipitation. You can have a lot of variation like wetlands, lakes, and streams. Spatial variability of benthic substrata, right? Large lakes are pretty boring in a lot of ways in the bottom because they're just fine sediments, and then there's open water, and that's the major thing. There's not a lot of habitat. Streams can be quite variable, but rivers like the Kansas River are not necessarily quite so variable. They're sandy bottom rivers. Unless you get into a log, they're not so variable. Wetlands are quite variable. Karst aquifers are more variable than something like a homogeneous aquifer that is just sand or something like that. Spatial linkage. So the river continuum was basically based on how you link things across space, and streams are very linked, right? The upstream to downstream. But if we think about the largest lakes and deep groundwater, they're pretty isolated from each other in a sense, and there's not quick spatial linkage. Autochthonous versus allochthonous, right? Streams and wetlands, small lakes have a lot of allochthonous carbon input. Deep groundwater have low. They rely on it, but the rates are low because they're far away from the production. Same with nutrient input. Things that are right on the land, shallow lakes, reservoirs have more contact with the land and the watershed than deep lakes with a smaller shoreline development index. If you'll remember that term, it might be something you get asked about in a final in the near future. Oligotrophic lakes, wetland streams are sort of in the middle. And the terrestrial influence, the streams, the wetlands high, small lakes, karst aquifers, medium, large lakes, deep groundwater have less. So just the idea of these variable gradients. And we're going to come back to these gradients when we talk about different biomes and how you might expect a lake or a stream to be in a different biome in the next chapter. And then we can also compare the trophic webs across these different ones. And again, these are things we've already talked about, but we're trying to give you the big picture here. We're trying to get at the big picture. And the groundwaters are the simple ones. You have external carbon, maybe some fine particulate organic material, microbes subsisting on that. Maybe a blind amphipod or an isopod if the space is big enough. If not, if it's a fine sediment, then it might be a protozoa would be the top, and that would be it. Maybe an amoeba would eat the protozoa. And this happens to be kind of what is going on at Kanza. In the karst aquifer, we have amphipods and isopods that are blind, and then we have a large predatory planarian that groundwater. So fairly short food webs, fairly simple food webs. In contrast, we're going to have wetlands where macrophytes can be really important and emergent vegetation can be quite important. Produce leaves for the shredders. Scrapers can still eat the periphyton growing on the solid surfaces like the macrophytes. Organic carbon coming in from outside. And then maybe some of these semi-terrestrial species, frogs and maybe herons or something like that coming into the wetlands, and the deep part fishes. Lakes, we have that distinction now. We've got the open water, right, where we can have more phytoplankton and zooplankton, maybe a phantom midge or a chiabris, some of the predatory, and then some fishes, maybe the planktivorous fishes and piscivorous fishes. But we also have the littoral zone, right? The shallower areas where light can reach. You get macrophytes and periphyton. You get snails, other scrapers, crayfish that maybe can shred up some of these macrophytes and eat and be predators on some of these other things. And then the streams, no phytoplankton there, right? A lot of organic carbon coming inside from outside, fueling the food web. We can have macrophytes in some streams if they have a stable hydrology. Oftentimes there's periphyton. We have the scrapers, the shredders, the collectors that we've talked about, and the predators when we talk about functional feeding groups of invertebrates.